Ladies and gentlemen, if you are enjoying my videos, please click the like button. It is the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. Rosa, now in the terminal stage of cancer, couldn't shake the words of her psychoanalyst. He had insisted that illnesses, even cancer, could stem from unresolved grudges. He advised her to unburden her hidden thoughts, to let go of her resentment. As she lay in her hospital bed, Rosa's mind drifted back to her childhood, to a tragic event involving her twin sister, Ruta, when they were just 13 years old. It was a vivid memory, one that she had buried deep within her, but it had never truly left her. It was a sweltering summer day, and the twins were in the kitchen, preparing a batch of fritters. The scent of sugar and cinnamon filled the air, mixing with the warm, earthy smell of the wooden cottage. The kitchen was their domain, a place of laughter and shared secrets, but that day it became a chamber of horror. Rosa had been stirring the hot oil, watching it bubble and froth, when it happened. Ruta was sitting on a wooden stool, her usual spot, when the leg of the stool gave way without warning. The crash was deafening, but it was the scream that followed that would haunt Rosa forever. Ruta tumbled backward, arms flailing, and fell into the pot of boiling oil. The sound of her body hitting the searing liquid was sickening, a grotesque sizzle that drowned out her initial cry. The smell of burning flesh and singed hair quickly overpowered the sweet aroma of their cooking. Rosa could see Ruta's face contorted in agony, her skin blistering and charring in the intense heat. Panic-stricken, Rosa could only watch as Ruta thrashed wildly, trying to escape the torment. Her clothes caught fire, and soon she was a frenzied, fiery specter, stumbling blindly around the kitchen. The flames consumed her, turning her into a grotesque figure of pain and suffering. Rosa's paralysis broke with a surge of adrenaline, and she grabbed a heavy blanket, throwing it over Ruta to smother the flames. The fire eventually died down, but the damage was irreversible. Ruta's body was a ruin of scorched flesh, her life forever altered in those horrific moments. That day marked the end of their carefree childhood. The memory of Ruta's agonized screams, the smell of her burning flesh, and the sight of her charred body were etched into Rosa's mind. It was a memory she had tried to escape, but it had always lingered, festering in the corners of her consciousness. Now, as Rosa faced her own mortality, she realized that the pain and guilt from that day had never truly left her. It had festered and grown, manifesting in her body as the cancer that was now consuming her. She understood that her psychoanalyst was right. She needed to confront these memories, to release the pent-up grief and guilt, if she had any hope of finding peace in her final days. Ruta was rushed to the hospital, where she spent the next 6 months in silent suffering. She did not utter a single word after the accident. The left side of her body had transformed into a continuous mass of scars, a grotesque reminder of that fateful day. Her silence was unnerving for Rosa, who found herself growing more terrified with each passing day. When Ruta finally returned home, she was a ghost of her former self. She did not go back to school and spent most of her days confined to her bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. The once vibrant and lively girl was now a silent, brooding presence that filled the house with an eerie stillness. Rosa could hardly recognize her sister and was deeply unsettled by Ruta's persistent silence and unblinking gaze. Their mother devoted herself entirely to Ruta's care, tending to her every need with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She barely acknowledged Rosa, her focus solely on the daughter who needed her most. Their father, on the other hand, buried himself in work, rarely coming home and avoiding the painful reality that awaited him there. The family's dynamic had shifted dramatically, creating a chasm of silence and sorrow that was almost palpable. Rosa felt increasingly isolated. The home that had once been filled with laughter and warmth was now a place of haunting quiet. The silence was heavy, oppressive, wrapping around her like a shroud. She was afraid of Ruta, not just because of her disfigurement, but because of the unnerving stillness that seemed to have taken over her soul. Ruta's eyes, once bright with mischief, now held a vacant, almost accusatory stare that made Rosa shiver. The sisters had once shared everything, but now there was a gulf between them that Rosa didn't know how to bridge. She was plagued by guilt, wondering if there was something more she could have done to prevent the accident, to save Ruta from this living nightmare. She felt helpless, trapped in a home where her parents barely spoke to her or each other, their lives consumed by the tragedy that had befallen Ruta. The heavy silence in the house was punctuated only by the occasional murmurs of their mother as she tended to Ruta or the distant hum of their father's car leaving for work. Rosa longed for the days when they were a family, before the accident had shattered their lives. But those days were gone, replaced by a suffocating quiet and a pervasive sense of dread. Rosa's fear of her sister grew, not because of what Ruta had become physically, but because of the silence that seemed to speak volumes. It was as if Ruta's unspoken words hung in the air, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had befallen them. Rosa knew that the silence needed to be broken, but she was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, unsure of how to reach her sister and bring back even a semblance of the life they once knew. Rosa felt a deep sense of shame and guilt about her behavior towards her sister. She couldn't bring herself to tell their mother the full story of what had happened that day. Instead, Rosa threw herself into helping with household chores, using her busyness as a shield to avoid discussing her feelings and the heavy burden she carried. Despite her efforts to help, Rosa was overwhelmed by stress and a profound sense of helplessness. She couldn't find a way to cope with Ruta's condition and her own emotions. Their mother's frequent reproaches didn't help. Often she would scold Rosa for forgetting to open the curtains in Ruta's room, a task that seemed minor but was laden with emotional weight. Ruta insisted on living in darkness, claiming that her burned skin was too sensitive to endure the sunlight. Every time Rosa forgot, her mother's voice would ring out, sharp and disapproving, "Rosa, the curtains. How many times must I remind you?" These reprimands cut deeply, reinforcing Rosa's feelings of inadequacy and guilt. She knew her mother's anger stemmed from grief and exhaustion, but it only added to the crushing weight she felt. As the months passed, Ruta's condition worsened. She became a permanent fixture in her darkened room, her life shrouded in shadows. The darkness seemed to seep into Rosa's soul, amplifying her fears and guilt. Ruta's aversion to light created an atmosphere of perpetual twilight in their home, which fed Rosa's anxieties. The once bright and cheerful house now felt like a tomb. Ruta's explanation for avoiding the light was logical. Her skin, covered in scars, was incredibly sensitive. Even a sliver of sunlight caused her excruciating pain. But for Rosa, it was more than just physical pain. The darkness represented Ruta's emotional and psychological state, a constant reminder of the trauma they had both endured. Rosa's fear of her sister grew more intense. Ruta's silent presence in the dark room became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. She felt trapped by her inability to change the past, to help Ruta heal, and to break through the suffocating silence that enveloped their lives. The house was filled with unspoken words and unacknowledged pain, creating a tension that was almost unbearable. One evening, as Rosa was helping her mother with dinner, she heard a faint noise from Ruta's room. It was rare for Ruta to make any sound, so Rosa hesitated, her heart pounding. She walked slowly to the door and gently pushed it open. The room was, as always, dark. She could barely make out Ruta's form on the bed. "Ruta," Rosa whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the oppressive silence. Rosa stepped closer, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. She saw Ruta's eyes open, staring blankly into the void. Rosa's heart ached at the sight of her sister's vacant expression. She wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, to bridge the gap between them. But the words caught in her throat. Rosa stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on her. She finally turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. She returned to the kitchen, her mother's disapproving gaze following her. "Did you open the curtains?" her mother asked, her tone flat. Rosa shook her head, unable to speak. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. The house, once a place of joy and light, was now a prison of shadows and unspoken sorrow. Rosa knew that if she didn't find a way to confront her fears and her guilt, the darkness would consume them all. Rosa's mother found a glimmer of hope in the fact that Ruta had begun to speak again, even if her speech was limited to simple words like yes and no. The psychiatrists explained that Ruta was living in her own world, a place where she was still healthy and whole. Her refusal to see the light, they said, was a psychological reaction, a way of coping with her trauma. Rosa took on the task of cleaning Ruta's room, ensuring it was kept in a sterile condition. she noticed strange things during her cleaning sessions, such as little piles of pill bugs in the corners. Despite the perpetual darkness, Ruta somehow noticed these insects and systematically destroyed them. Rosa found this both surprising and unsettling. How could Ruta, who barely moved or spoke, be so aware of the tiniest intrusions in her dark sanctuary? As she dusted and scrubbed, Rosa couldn't help but feel that their home was becoming more like a crypt with each passing day. The oppressive silence and darkness seemed to seep into every corner of the house, turning it into a place of mourning and decay. Rosa pitied her sister, realizing that Ruta would never marry, never leave the house, and perhaps never find peace. The thought was almost too much to bear. To escape the heavy atmosphere, Rosa found solace in caring for the newborn piglets on their small farm. The piglets were a welcome distraction, their tiny squeals and playful antics a reminder of life and vitality. As she fed and cleaned the piglets, Rosa remembered how much Ruta had once loved them. They used to spend hours in the barn together, laughing and playing with the animals. Those memories seemed like fragments from another life, a life that had ended the day of the accident. One afternoon, while attending to the piglets, Rosa's thoughts drifted back to Ruta. She could see her sister's face as it had been, bright and full of life, so different from the haunted, scarred visage that now lay in the darkened room upstairs. The contrast was heartbreaking. Rosa wished she could turn back time, undo the accident, and restore Ruta to her former self. As she worked, Rosa felt a growing determination to break through the wall of silence and darkness that surrounded her sister. She resolved to find a way to help Ruta, to bring a sliver of light back into her world. But for now, all she could do was care for the piglets, clinging to the small joys they brought, and hope that someday, somehow, Ruta would find her way back to the light. Rosa's mother asked her to take breakfast to Ruta, who still sat in her perpetual darkness. Rosa entered the room, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. Her words, however, seemed to vanish into the void. Ruta's response was a cold, chilling stare that made Rosa's skin crawl. The emptiness in Ruta's gaze was unsettling, a void that threatened to swallow any warmth or light. Their mother had finally decided that it was time to move Ruta to the attic, where a dark room could better accommodate her needs. She called upon the neighbor boys to help carry Ruta's belongings upstairs. The task of finding material to cover the window in Ruta's new room fell to Rosa. She was instructed to buy the thickest fabric she could find to ensure no light would penetrate the room. Rosa walked briskly to the local shop, the tension in her shoulders reflecting the urgency of her errand. Upon entering the small, cluttered store, she greeted Svetochka, the shopkeeper, and explained her need for dense curtain material. Svetochka initially resisted, her eyes narrowing as she tried to dissuade Rosa. "I don't think we have anything suitable in stock, dear," she said with a dismissive wave. "Perhaps you should check the market in the next town over." But Rosa was determined. She insisted, her voice steady and firm, that they check the back room. "Please, Svetochka, it's urgent. I know you must have something." Reluctantly, Svetochka led Rosa to the storage area. After a brief search, they found a roll of heavy black tarpaulin, dusty and forgotten, in a corner. It was exactly what Rosa needed. She could tell Svetochka was hesitant to sell it, perhaps due to the fabric's unusual and grim nature, but Rosa was insistent. "I'll take it," Rosa said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Svetochka sighed but acquiesced, cutting off a generous portion of the tarpaulin and wrapping it up. With the fabric in hand, Rosa returned home. The dark material felt almost like a shroud in her arms, a fitting symbol for the life Ruta now led. Rosa's determination to help her sister, despite the fear and tension between them, drove her forward. She set to work immediately, cutting and sewing the tarpaulin into makeshift curtains that would banish any hint of light from Ruta's new room. As she sewed, Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that their home was becoming more like a tomb with each passing day. The darkness Ruta demanded seeped into every corner of their lives, but Rosa hoped that by creating a space where Ruta felt safe, she might one day coax her sister back into the light. For now, though, she had to ensure Ruta's comfort, even if it meant embracing the shadows that had taken hold of their lives. Rosa diligently worked on the curtains for Ruta's new attic room, determined to make them as comforting as possible despite the heavy, dark fabric. She used the old sewing machine, its rhythmic clatter a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. To soften the rough appearance of the tarpaulin, she meticulously added beadwork, creating delicate patterns that shimmered faintly in the dim light. When she finished, Rosa was satisfied with her work, hoping the small embellishments might bring a touch of beauty to Ruta's somber existence. The day of the move was arduous and emotionally taxing. The neighbor boys helped carry Ruta's sparse belongings up to the attic, but the most challenging part was moving Ruta herself. Every step seemed to cause her pain, her frail body racked with silent agony. The journey took hours, each moment stretching painfully as they maneuvered her through the narrow hallways and up the steep stairs. At one particularly difficult point, Ruta gasped, her voice a harsh whisper as she said, "It hurts." The words, simple yet laden with anguish, sent a chill through Rosa. It was the first time in so long that Ruta had expressed any feeling beyond her usual silence. Rosa felt a mix of fear and revulsion, her sister's pain a raw, palpable thing that she didn't know how to handle. Finally, Ruta was settled in the darkened attic room. The newly made curtains hung heavily over the windows, casting the room in complete darkness. Rosa's mother spent more time with Ruta, attending to her needs with a tender care that seemed to deepen the rift between Rosa and the rest of the family. While her mother was with Ruta, Rosa took on the full burden of managing the household. She cooked, cleaned, and maintained the farm, her hands and mind constantly busy to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. Rosa's days became a blur of chores and responsibilities, her only respite the brief moments she allowed herself to sit quietly and remember better times. Despite her exhaustion, she couldn't escape the feeling that their home was increasingly resembling a crypt, each room a silent testament to loss and suffering. Her mother's focus on Ruta left Rosa feeling more isolated than ever. Though she understood her mother's dedication, it didn't lessen the sting of abandonment. Rosa's world had narrowed to the confines of their home and the endless tasks that kept it running, her only solace the thought that, in some small way, she was still helping her sister. But in the quiet moments of the night, when the chores were done and the house was still, Rosa's thoughts would wander to Ruta. She wondered if her sister would ever emerge from the darkness, if she would ever again be the lively, joyful girl Rosa remembered. The beadwork on the curtains seemed a fragile hope, a faint light in the overwhelming gloom. Rosa knew she had to hold on to that hope, however tenuous it might be. For her sister's sake, and for her own, she needed to believe that there was a way back from the darkness, even if the path was shrouded and uncertain. Rosa discovered the disappearance of one of the piglets and was perplexed when she learned that Ruta had requested it. Her mother confirmed this, her expression a mix of surprise and bewilderment. Ruta asking for anything was a rarity, let alone a live animal. Rosa couldn't shake the unsettling feeling the request brought. That night, as the household settled into a tense silence, sudden sounds and the frantic squealing of the piglet echoed from the attic. The noise was sharp and frantic, slicing through the night and sending shivers down Rosa's spine. Her mother, reacting quickly, ran towards the attic. But by the time she reached the door, the squealing had abruptly stopped, leaving only an eerie stillness. The silence that followed was thick with dread, and they stood frozen in uncertainty and fear. The next morning, Rosa woke with a heavy sense of foreboding. She went to the kitchen and found her mother sitting motionless at the table. This sight was so out of character that it stopped Rosa in her tracks. Her mother, usually bustling with morning activities, now sat unnaturally still, her eyes staring blankly ahead. Mom Rosa's voice trembled as she approached. The lack of response heightened her anxiety. She gently touched her mother's shoulder, but there was no reaction, no acknowledgement. The stillness in her mother's eyes was unnerving, a stark contrast to her usual vibrant demeanor. Rosa's heart pounded as she scanned the room, her mind racing with possibilities. What had happened last night? Why was her mother behaving this way? The events of the previous night, the haunting squeals of the piglet, and now this eerie morning silence, all blended into a sinister tableau that Rosa couldn't comprehend. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Mom, please talk to me," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. But her mother remained unresponsive, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond Rosa's reach. Rosa's fear grew, a gnawing sensation that something terrible had taken root in their home. Desperate for answers, Rosa decided she had to face the attic and see for herself what had transpired during the night. She glanced once more at her mother, hoping for some sign of recognition or reassurance, but found none. The oppressive silence weighed heavily on her as she turned and made her way towards the stairs, each step a mix of trepidation and determination. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and unspoken horrors. Rosa's mind raced with thoughts of Ruta, the piglet, and the inexplicable events that seemed to be spiraling out of control. She knew she had to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be, to bring some semblance of peace back to her fractured family. Rosa was deeply troubled by her mother's strange behavior. Her once lively and nurturing mother now appeared pale and distant, her eyes clouded with confusion. When Rosa attempted to engage her in conversation, her mother responded with uncharacteristic bitterness and bewilderment, snapping at Rosa without reason. This sudden shift in demeanor left Rosa feeling unsettled and anxious. Despite the disturbing events unfolding around her, Rosa pushed forward with her daily chores. She focused on caring for the cow, hoping the familiar routines would provide some semblance of normalcy. While tending to the cow, she encountered Alexei, the shepherd's assistant. He smiled warmly and invited her to the upcoming dance. Rosa, though tempted by the offer of a brief escape from her troubles, declined. She felt an overwhelming obligation to stay and support her mother. Returning home from her tasks, Rosa was taken aback to find a small crowd gathered outside her house. Neighbors were talking in hushed tones, and the local medic, carrying his black bag, was in deep conversation with a few of them. The sight filled her with dread. She quickened her pace, anxiety gnawing at her insides. As she approached, snippets of conversation reached her ears. Words like Ruta's strange behavior and family problems swirled around her, heightening her fear. The neighbors' faces were etched with concern and curiosity, their eyes occasionally darting towards the house. Rosa pushed through the crowd, her heart racing. She found the medic speaking with Mrs. Ivanova, the neighbor who had always been overly curious about their family. He noticed Rosa and turned to her with a grave expression. "Rosa, we need to talk about Ruta," he said, his voice low and serious. Rosa nodded, her throat dry. She led him inside, where her mother was still sitting, staring vacantly at the kitchen table. The medic examined her briefly, his frown deepening. "She's in shock," he said. "Whatever happened last night has deeply affected her. And we need to understand what's going on with Ruta." Rosa felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't yet faced the attic, hadn't confronted whatever horror had occurred. She glanced at her mother, who seemed a mere shell of her former self, and steeled herself for what was to come. With a deep breath, she led the medic towards the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with anticipation and fear. The attic door loomed ahead, a silent guardian to the unknown terror within. As they reached the top, Rosa hesitated. The memory of the piglet's screams echoed in her mind, and she had to summon all her courage to push the door open. The room was dark, the air stale and oppressive. In the faint light filtering through the cracks, she saw Ruta sitting in the corner, her face turned away. The medic moved forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam landed on Ruta, who flinched but didn't turn. The piglet was nowhere to be seen, but a dark stain on the floor hinted at something dreadful. "Ruta," the medic said gently, "we're here to help." Ruta's head slowly turned, and Rosa caught a glimpse of her eyes haunted, filled with an unspoken horror. The medic knelt beside her, checking her pulse and examining her carefully. His face remained composed, but Rosa saw the flicker of concern in his eyes. "We need to get her out of here," he said finally. "This place isn't safe for her." Rosa nodded, relief and fear mingling within her. She hoped that getting Ruta out of the attic, away from the darkness, might help her recover. But the events of the past days had shaken her deeply, and she knew that the road to healing would be long and fraught with challenges. As they carefully helped Ruta down the stairs, Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that their home, once a sanctuary, had become a place of shadows and secrets, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be, to reclaim some semblance of peace for her family. Rosa faced an emotional upheaval as whispers and rumors about her family circulated through their small community. The harshest words came from their neighbor, Baba Liuba, whose gossiping tongue spared no one. Rosa overheard her in the market, speaking to a group of women. "That family is cursed," Baba Luba said, her voice dripping with disdain. "First the accident, now this. It's not normal." The sting of these words cut deeply. Rosa's heart ached as she hurried away, unable to bear the judgmental stares and whispered accusations. She felt the weight of their scrutiny, the isolation pressing down on her. Her family was breaking apart, and the town's relentless gossip only made it worse. The next blow came with brutal swiftness. One evening, the local policeman arrived at their door, his face grim. He gently informed Rosa that her mother had been taken to the hospital after a suicide attempt. She had prepared a batch of pancakes, written a simple note saying, "I love you," and then inflicted severe injuries upon herself. Rosa's world tilted on its axis. The thought of her mother, so broken and desperate, shook her to the core. She felt a surge of panic and helplessness, a desperate need to understand how things had unraveled so completely. As if this weren't enough, her father, already a distant and shadowy figure, descended further into alcoholism. The stress and turmoil had driven him to drink, and he staggered through their home in a drunken stupor. The smell of alcohol clung to him, a potent reminder of his inability to cope. The authorities questioned him, pressing for answers he couldn't provide. Eventually overwhelmed and broken, he left for the hospital, leaving Rosa to shoulder the burden alone. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence filled with ghosts of the past. Rosa stood in the center of their kitchen, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. She had to take care of Ruta, to navigate the darkness that had engulfed their lives. The task seemed insurmountable, but there was no one else. She walked up the stairs to Ruta's room, the curtain she had made still blocking out the light. Inside, Ruta sat in her usual spot, a fragile figure in the shadows. Rosa knelt beside her, taking her sister's hand in her own. "We'll get through this," Rosa whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. "I promise." Ruta's eyes, reflecting a flicker of recognition, were the only response. Rosa squeezed her sister's hand, drawing strength from the small connection. She knew they were facing a long and difficult road, but she was determined to find a way out of the darkness for both of them. Days turned into weeks, each filled with the same relentless routine. Rosa managed the household, cared for Ruta, and visited their mother in the hospital. The weight of it all threatened to crush her, but she refused to give in to despair. In the quiet moments of the night, when exhaustion claimed her, Rosa would dream of a time when their family was whole and happy. Those memories gave her the strength to keep going, to fight for a future where they could find peace and light once more. The town continued to gossip, but Rosa learned to ignore the whispers. Her focus remained on her family, on the fragile hope that they could heal and reclaim their lives. She clung to that hope, even as the shadows deepened around them, determined to find a way back to the light. Rosa was left alone with her heavy thoughts and the daunting responsibilities of caring for her sister. Her father's parting words echoed in her mind, a grim directive that added weight to her already overwhelming burden: take care of your sister. The responsibility was immense, and the stress of it all gnawed at her, day and night. Rosa felt a growing sense of fear and anxiety towards Ruta. Every trip up to the attic, where Ruta now lived, filled her with dread. The attic had become a place of darkness and unsettling sounds, a space where shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. Rosa carried meals up to her sister, her hands trembling as she approached the door, the sounds from within heightening her sense of unease. At night, the house took on an even more sinister aspect. One night, Rosa was jolted awake by an intense feeling of being watched. Her skin prickled with an instinctual fear. She slowly turned her head and saw, in the dim light, Ruta sitting in the corner of her room, her eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. Ruta's presence there, silent and still, was terrifying. Rosa's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding wildly. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words stuck in her throat. The fear was paralyzing. Ruta's eyes seemed to bore into her, filled with an unspoken menace that Rosa couldn't understand. For a long moment, they remained like that, Rosa frozen in her bed and Ruta in the corner, the silence heavy and oppressive. Finally, Ruta stood up slowly and, without a word, left the room. The sound of her footsteps receded into the darkness, leaving Rosa shaken and unable to move. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and restless thoughts. Rosa lay awake, her mind racing with questions and fears. What had driven Ruta to come downstairs? What was happening to her sister? The incident only deepened Rosa's sense of dread, making her feel even more isolated and helpless. The next day, Rosa went through her chores in a daze, her mind clouded by the events of the previous night. The house felt more like a prison, each room filled with memories of happier times now overshadowed by the present darkness. She moved mechanically, her body exhausted but her mind unable to rest. When it was time to take Ruta her meal, Rosa hesitated at the foot of the attic stairs, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the climb. Each step felt like a journey into the unknown, the shadows at the top of the stairs seeming to pulse with malevolent intent. As she opened the door to the attic, she was met with the familiar oppressive darkness. Ruta was sitting in her usual spot, her eyes blank and distant. Rosa placed the tray of food on the floor and backed away quickly, the fear gnawing at her insides. "Ruta," she said softly, hoping for some response, some sign of her sister's former self. But Ruta remained silent, her gaze fixed on a point beyond Rosa's reach. Rosa left the attic, closing the door behind her with a shuddering sigh. She leaned against the wall, her legs shaking. The weight of her responsibilities and the fear of what was happening to her sister threatened to crush her. She knew she had to stay strong, for Ruta's sake and for her own, but each day it became harder to find that strength. The house, once a place of safety and warmth, had become a realm of shadows and fear. Rosa could only hope that somewhere, somehow there was a way to bring light back into their lives, to dispel the darkness that had taken hold. But for now, she could only endure, one day at a time, each night bringing new fears and challenges to face. Rosa's father retreated into a state of deep depression, distancing himself from the crumbling remnants of their family life. His refuge became the garage, where he buried himself in the mechanical work of repairing old farm equipment. His hands, once steady and strong, now trembled slightly as he tinkered with the rusted engines and broken tools. The garage was his sanctuary, a place where he could drown out the pain and guilt that gnawed at him. He avoided the house altogether, unable to bear the sight of the shattered family he had once been a part of. The once vibrant man was now a shadow of his former self, gaunt and hollow-eyed. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, his face drawn and tired. The spark of life that had once animated his movements was extinguished, replaced by a haunting melancholy. He seemed to have lost his sense of purpose, trapped in a cycle of grief and denial. Meanwhile, Rosa was left to manage the house and care for Ruta, her own emotional reserve stretched thin. Every day, she struggled to maintain some semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos. With her mother in the hospital recovering from her suicide attempt, Rosa prepared to visit her. The thought of her mother lying in a sterile hospital room, battling her own demons, weighed heavily on her. In preparation for the visit, Rosa decided to bring her mother some of her favorite treats. She hoped that the familiar flavors would provide some comfort and solace during her time of need. She carefully baked a batch of her mother's cherished pastries, the sweet aroma filling the house and temporarily masking the underlying tension. As Rosa prepared the food, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness and frustration. The mother she remembered, full of warmth and laughter, was now a fragile figure struggling with her own despair. The contrast between her mother's current state and the vibrant woman from her childhood was stark and heartbreaking. When she arrived at the hospital, the sight of her mother lying in a hospital bed, pale and weak, was almost too much to bear. Rosa gently placed the pastries on a nearby table and sat beside her mother. She spoke softly, trying to bridge the gap between their worlds with stories of home and the small victories of everyday life. Her mother, eyes heavy with exhaustion, managed a faint smile, but it was clear that she was trapped in a haze of sadness. Rosa's visits became a fragile lifeline, a moment of connection amidst the overwhelming darkness that surrounded them all. She clung to the hope that her presence, however small, might offer some comfort to her mother and remind her of the love that still existed, even in the midst of despair. Back at home, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken grief. Her father's absence in the house was palpable. and his unwillingness to confront the reality of their situation only added to the family's sense of desolation. The garage, once a place of industriousness, now stood as a monument to his retreat from the harsh truths of their lives. Rosa saw the toll that their collective trauma had taken on her father. He had withered physically and emotionally, his once robust frame now thin and frail. His laughter, once a familiar and comforting sound, had disappeared, replaced by the quiet hum of engines and the occasional, melancholic sigh. As Rosa balanced her efforts between caring for Ruta, visiting her mother, and grappling with her father's retreat, she felt the weight of their collective suffering. The house seemed to breathe in the sorrow and fear, each room a reminder of what they had lost. Yet, despite the despair, Rosa resolved to keep moving forward, holding on to the hope that someday, somehow, they would find their way back to a place of healing and light. Rosa took it upon herself to visit her mother in the hospital, fully aware that her father needed rest. His emotional and physical state had deteriorated, and he had retreated further into himself. Rosa, recognizing the urgency of the situation and her father's desperate need for respite, resolved to make the trip to the hospital. It was a testament to her resilience and commitment to her family, even as she grappled with her own fears and exhaustion. When Rosa arrived at the hospital, she approached the reception desk where a stern-faced nurse sat behind a glass partition. The nurse's demeanor was initially brusque, reflecting the clinical detachment often associated with hospital work. "Can I help you?" the nurse asked, her voice clipped and professional. "I'm here to visit my mother," Rosa said, her voice trembling slightly. She provided her mother's name and details, hoping her request would be met with understanding. The nurse's eyes flickered with a momentary hardness as she scanned the information. The family's distress was apparent, but the nurse's initial reaction was impersonal, shaped by a long day of managing countless similar requests. However, as she processed the details and recognized the name, her expression softened. She looked up at Rosa with a mixture of sympathy and professional concern. "Oh, I see. You're her daughter," the nurse said, her tone now gentler. "I didn't realize. I'm sorry for the confusion. It's been a rough day here." Rosa nodded, her relief palpable. "Yes, I'm Rosa. I understand it's not visiting hours, but I'd really like to see her. I know she's been struggling, and I want to be there for her." The nurse studied Rosa for a moment, noting the exhaustion and determination etched into her features. With a sigh, she seemed to make a decision. "I can make an exception. Follow me." The nurse led Rosa through the labyrinth of hospital corridors, her path illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights. The air was cool and sterile, the antiseptic smell a constant reminder of the clinical environment. Rosa tried to steady her nerves as she walked, the weight of her mother's suffering pressing heavily on her shoulders. At the ward, the nurse helped Rosa into a set of medical scrubs, ensuring she followed the hospital's protocols. Rosa felt a sense of strange detachment as she changed, the soft rustling of the fabric contrasting with her turbulent emotions. The nurse guided her to the door of her mother's room and gave a reassuring nod. "Remember, you have only a short time. I'll let you in, but please be mindful of the time." Rosa nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she entered the room. The sight that met her eyes was both heartbreaking and familiar. Her mother lay in the hospital bed, a fragile figure surrounded by the beeping of monitors and the sterile whiteness of the sheets. The room was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of medical equipment and the soft rustle of the curtains. Rosa approached the bedside slowly, her breath catching as she saw her mother's pale face. Her mother's eyes, once so full of life and warmth, now looked hollow and distant. Rosa gently took her mother's hand, her own trembling as she tried to muster the strength to speak. "Mom," Rosa said softly, her voice breaking. "It's me, Rosa. I'm here." Her mother's eyes fluttered open, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and shared pain. Rosa squeezed her mother's hand, tears streaming down her face. "I've brought some of your favorite pastries," Rosa said, her voice cracking. "I know it's not much, but I thought it might make you feel a bit better." Her mother's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Rosa saw a glimmer of the woman she had once known. It was a fleeting connection, but it was enough to give Rosa a small measure of hope. She sat by her mother's side, talking softly, sharing stories of home and the everyday details of life that might bring some comfort. As the minutes ticked by, the nurse returned to gently remind Rosa of the time. Reluctantly, Rosa rose from the chair, giving her mother's hand one last squeeze. "I'll be back soon," she promised, though she wasn't sure when that would be. The nurse escorted Rosa out, her sympathy evident in the softening of her eyes and the gentle way she guided her back to the entrance. As Rosa left the hospital, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The visit had been brief, but it had provided a small ray of hope in the midst of their family's darkness. Back at home, Rosa returned to her duties, carrying with her the fragile comfort of the visit. She knew the path ahead was still fraught with challenges, but each small gesture of connection and care brought her a step closer to finding a semblance of peace amidst the turmoil. Rosa's heart sank as she entered the intensive care unit, the sight before her almost too much to bear. Her mother lay in the stark, sterile environment of the ICU, a fragile figure amidst the labyrinth of medical equipment. Tubes and wires connected her to various monitors and IV drips, her body marked by the heavy trauma of her recent attempt. The rhythmic beep of the machines and the soft hiss of the ventilator were the only sounds that accompanied her mother's deep, unresponsive sleep. Her mother's arms were heavily bandaged, the once familiar hands now swathed in gauze and medical tape. The sight of her mother's injuries, combined with the starkness of the hospital room, was overwhelming. Rosa felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She fought to maintain composure, but the sight of her mother, so helpless and vulnerable, was breaking her resolve. Rosa approached the bedside with a small bundle of treats wrapped carefully. She had brought these with the hope that they might offer some small comfort, a reminder of better days. She handed the bundle to the nurse, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, give these to my mother. I just wanted her to have something familiar." The nurse took the bundle with a gentle nod, her face reflecting a compassionate understanding. Rosa tried to focus on the nurse's kindness as she turned to leave, her heart heavy with the weight of her mother's condition. As she walked out of the ICU, her tears finally broke free, streaming down her face. Each step felt heavier as she made her way to the hospital exit, the burden of the visit weighing on her. She had hoped for some small sign of improvement, but instead she was faced with the harsh reality of her mother's severe state. Returning home, the atmosphere was no less grim. The house felt cold and unwelcoming, mirroring the chaos and despair that had become a constant presence in their lives. Rosa entered the garage and found her father slumped against a workbench, his usually strong frame now almost unrecognizable under the effects of heavy drinking. His eyes were bleary, his movements sluggish. The scent of alcohol hung thickly in the air, a pungent reminder of his deteriorating state. Rosa's heart ached at the sight. Her father, once a pillar of strength, was now a shell of the man he had been, lost in a haze of despair and liquor. Without a word, Rosa moved to her father's side, her arms straining as she tried to help him to his feet. He was unsteady, leaning heavily on her as she half-guided, half-dragged him towards the house. His weight was a burden, and the task of maneuvering him was both physically and emotionally draining. As they staggered towards the house, Rosa's frustration and sorrow welled up. She could feel the weight of their collective despair pressing down on her, her own exhaustion amplifying the challenge. Her father's muttering was incoherent, and he offered little assistance, his state of inebriation leaving him almost completely incapacitated. Once inside, Rosa managed to guide her father to a chair in the living room, where he slumped heavily, his head drooping. She stood over him, her own fatigue evident in the dark circles under her eyes and the strained set of her shoulders. The house seemed to close in around them, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The responsibilities she faced were enormous, and the weight of her family's suffering seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. She glanced around the dimly lit room, the familiar surroundings now seeming foreign and unsettling. Rosa knew she had to continue shouldering these burdens for herself and for her family, despite the crushing emotional toll. As she looked at her father, she wondered how much longer they could endure this spiral into darkness. Yet, in that moment, the harsh reality was clear she was alone in a sea of turmoil, trying to keep her family afloat amidst the storm. Rosa was increasingly fearful of her sister Ruta, whose behavior had become increasingly erratic and aggressive. One evening, Rosa, driven by a mixture of concern and curiosity, attempted to approach Ruta's secluded corner of the attic. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small, flickering lamp that cast eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with a musty smell, and the cluttered space was strewn with various objects that Ruta had amassed over time. Rosa's eyes were drawn to a small, shadowy table in the center of the room. It was covered with a patchwork of fabric, threads, and what seemed to be pieces of broken porcelain. Rosa's heart pounded as she stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the enigmatic collection. She had heard strange noises coming from Ruta's room and was determined to understand what was causing her sister's increasingly bizarre behavior. As Rosa reached out to investigate, Ruta's reaction was immediate and violent. The moment Rosa's hand grazed the edge of the table, Ruta's eyes flashed with a wild, unearthly intensity. She leaped from her corner with a ferocity that caught Rosa off guard. Ruta's grip was like iron as she clamped down on Rosa's arm, her nails digging in painfully. Rosa winced in agony as Ruta's eyes bore into her with a mixture of fear and rage. The strength of her sister's grasp left a deep bruise, and Rosa could hardly believe the force with which Ruta was holding her. "Don't touch my things," Ruta hissed, her voice barely more than a guttural growl. Her tone was laced with an unsettling blend of anger and desperation. Rosa recoiled, pulling her arm free with great effort, her mind racing with confusion and fear. She staggered back, trying to regain her composure, while Ruta returned to her corner, mumbling incoherently about her craft and how everything had to stay just so. Rosa's heart raced as she left the room, her mind reeling from the unsettling encounter. That night, Rosa's exhaustion was overwhelming, but sleep remained elusive. As she lay in bed, the weight of her daily struggles pressed heavily on her shoulders. The relentless tension and fear left her in a state of constant unease. It was just past midnight when she felt a disconcerting sensation, an invisible force tugging at her pillow. Her eyes snapped open, her breath hitching in her throat. The room was dark, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind outside. Rosa lay perfectly still, her mind frantically searching for a rational explanation. The feeling of someone or something pulling at her pillow was unnervingly real, and she could not shake the creeping sense of dread that washed over her. Desperate to make sense of the strange occurrence, Rosa swung her legs over the side of the bed and crept to the attic door, her footsteps light and tentative. She hesitated for a moment, trying to listen for any signs of movement from Ruta's room. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the wind. As Rosa approached the attic, the darkness seemed to close in around her. She quietly opened the door, peering into the gloom. The attic was filled with a disarray of forgotten items, their shapes obscured by shadows. The dim light of the small lamp in Ruta's room flickered weakly, casting long, haunting shadows. Rosa's pulse quickened as she saw Ruta sitting on her mattress, her face partially hidden beneath a tangle of hair. Ruta was mumbling softly, her words barely intelligible. "Don't touch the threads. Don't touch the needles. They're forbidden." Ruta whispered repeatedly, her voice a disconcerting mix of anger and fear. The sight of her sister's huddled form and her cryptic mutterings sent a shiver down Rosa's spine. Ruta's presence was both unsettling and menacing, her unpredictable behavior making it impossible for Rosa to feel safe. She stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the sight of her sister's disheveled, haunted appearance and the ominous tone of her warnings. Rosa knew she needed to retreat, her own sense of dread overwhelming her. She quietly closed the attic door and returned to her room, trying to convince herself that the nightmarish events were just the result of her frayed nerves. Yet as she lay back in bed, the image of Ruta's disturbed figure and the eerie pull on her pillow lingered, casting a long shadow over her already troubled mind. Rosa's unease about Ruta's mental state grew more palpable each day. Her sister's behavior seemed increasingly erratic, her voice taking on a disturbing duality that suggested a deep-seated psychological disturbance. Despite her growing concerns, the doctors repeatedly assured Rosa that Ruta was physically stable and that her mental state, though unusual, was within acceptable bounds. Their reassurances did little to allay Rosa's fears. The disconcerting changes in Ruta's demeanor left Rosa feeling adrift in a sea of confusion and dread. One afternoon, Rosa's father arrived home with a field medic, an elderly man known for his pragmatic approach to medical issues. The medic had been called to examine Ruta after her increasing unpredictability had become a significant concern. Rosa watched from a distance as her father and the medic entered the attic, the tension in the air almost tangible. The medic's questions were methodical, probing into Ruta's condition with a professional curiosity that only deepened Rosa's anxiety. He inquired about Ruta's burns, her behavior, and the strange shifts in her voice. As he spoke, he observed Ruta with a practiced eye, noting her ability to alter her tone and mannerisms with disconcerting ease, depending on who she was addressing. "I've noticed she has a strange way of changing her voice," the medic commented, his voice carrying a note of intrigue. "It's as if she's not entirely present, or perhaps she's playing a role. It's quite unusual." Rosa shivered at his words, feeling a chill run down her spine. The medic's observations seemed to mirror her own growing fears about her sister's mental state. As the medic concluded his examination and left the attic, Rosa was left alone with her troubled thoughts. Later that day, as Rosa was tidying up the attic, she stumbled upon a familiar object among Ruta's belongings, a delicate hairpin that once belonged to their mother. The sight of it sent a pang of anxiety through Rosa. The pin, with its intricate design and motherly significance, seemed out of place in the cluttered, dark attic. With a heavy heart, Rosa decided to visit her mother at the hospital again. She felt an urgent need to talk to her, to seek some semblance of comfort and understanding amidst the chaos. As she entered the hospital, the sterile smell and the low hum of machinery felt like a strange relief from the suffocating atmosphere at home. In the quiet, dimly lit hospital room, Rosa sat by her mother's bedside, clutching the hairpin tightly in her hand. Her mother's condition had not improved significantly since her last visit. She remained in a state of deep, unsettling sleep, connected to an array of medical devices. Rosa spoke softly to her mother, her voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and desperation. "Mom, I found this pin in Ruta's things. I'm so worried about her. She's been acting so strange, and the doctors keep saying she's fine, but I don't know what to think anymore." As she spoke, Rosa's eyes wandered around the room, her mind racing with thoughts of Ruta's unsettling behavior. She mentioned Ruta's persistent obsession with her crafting, the strange shifts in her personality, and the disconcerting changes in her voice. Her mother remained silent, her eyes closed, but Rosa felt compelled to continue, as if speaking her fears aloud might somehow offer her solace. The nurse who had helped Rosa in her previous visits entered the room, her expression sympathetic as she listened to Rosa's concerns. "Sometimes," the nurse said gently, "a person's mind can react in ways we don't fully understand, especially under extreme stress. It's important to continue to support and monitor her, but it's also crucial to take care of yourself." Rosa nodded, wiping away a tear. The nurse's words offered little immediate comfort, but they reminded her of the importance of both her own well-being and her continued vigilance. As she prepared to leave the hospital, she felt a mixture of dread and resolve. The hairpin, a symbol of her mother's presence, was a stark reminder of how much she had to lose. Returning home, Rosa found herself haunted by the image of Ruta's unsettling behavior and the grim reality of her mother's condition. Each day seemed to blur into the next, a relentless cycle of worry and fear. The challenges ahead seemed insurmountable, but Rosa knew she had to face them with whatever strength she could muster, for her family and for herself. Rosa's visit to the hospital that day had been fraught with emotional intensity. Sitting by her mother's bed, she had attempted to extract any form of explanation or comfort regarding Ruta's disturbing behavior. With tears streaming down her face, Rosa's mother had been overwhelmed by the question. Her mother's eyes, normally so full of warmth and reassurance, were now vacant and filled with an almost unbearable sorrow. When Rosa pressed her for answers about Ruta, what was happening to her, and why her behavior had become so troubling, her mother broke down completely. The older woman sobbed uncontrollably, her body shaking with each gasp of breath. The weight of her own inability to provide answers seemed to suffocate her, and she could only manage incoherent murmurs through her tears. Rosa's heart ached seeing her mother so utterly broken and helpless. She could sense a deep, unspoken agony in her mother's eyes, but received no clear response, only the anguished cries that seemed to reverberate through the sterile hospital room. The situation grew more strained when the nurse, a stern woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, intervened. The nurse had noticed Rosa's repeated attempts to breach the hospital's visiting hours, and her patience was wearing thin. With an authoritative tone and a firm hand, she ushered Rosa out of the room. "You must leave now," she said, her voice clipped and final. "Visitors are only allowed during scheduled hours. You cannot continue to demand more access. It's not allowed." Rosa felt a sharp pang of frustration and helplessness as she was pushed out of the room. The nurse's reprimand echoed in her ears as she made her way down the sterile hospital corridors. The experience left her feeling more isolated than ever, her pleas for understanding met with barriers and indifference. Returning home was a bitter disappointment. The burden of managing the household while coping with her family's crises had begun to take a severe toll on Rosa. As she entered her dimly lit kitchen, exhaustion clung to her like a shroud. She felt every muscle in her body ache with fatigue, her spirit flagging under the relentless strain. One particular issue, the stubbornness of the family cow, exacerbated Rosa's sense of defeat. She had hoped that after a day spent grazing in the lush fields, the cow would provide a generous supply of milk. Instead, the cow stood in the barn, its udders dry despite her prolonged efforts to coax it into giving milk. The disappointment was palpable, each failed attempt at milking adding to Rosa's growing list of frustrations. Every mundane task seemed to amplify her sense of desolation. The milk pail felt heavier than ever, and the sound of the cow's gentle lowing, which once was comforting, now only seemed to mock her efforts. As Rosa wrestled with the uncooperative animal, she found herself near tears. The struggle with the cow was symbolic of the larger battles she faced daily, her efforts seemingly in vain against an unyielding tide of misfortune. By the time she finished her chores, the setting sun cast long shadows across the kitchen floor. Rosa felt as though she were living in a relentless twilight of fear and exhaustion, each day blurring into the next without respite. The dark, oppressive atmosphere of her home seemed to close in on her, amplifying her anxiety and fatigue. Rosa sank into a chair, her mind reeling with the emotional and physical toll of her responsibilities. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its walls lined with reminders of her family's suffering. As she stared blankly at the empty milk pail, her thoughts wandered back to her mother's tear-streaked face and the hollow void of Ruta's distressing silence. The enormity of her situation seemed almost too much to bear, and Rosa grappled with the suffocating weight of her own despair, feeling more isolated and overwhelmed than ever before. Rosa's attempt to escape the overwhelming darkness that had consumed her home led her to a small sliver of normalcy, her brief interactions with Alyosha, the young shepherd who had previously invited her to the village dance. While the idea of attending the dance felt daunting, Rosa opted instead for a quiet walk with Alyosha, hoping the fresh air and change of scenery might offer her a temporary reprieve from her grim reality. As they strolled along the dirt path that wound through the meadows, Alyosha chatted amiably, trying to lift Rosa's spirits with light-hearted conversation. Rosa, however, found solace in sharing her own dreams, her voice tinged with a wistful hope. She spoke passionately about her love for sewing, particularly her dream of one day designing wedding dresses. The vision of delicate fabrics and intricate lace offered a stark contrast to her current life, providing a small but meaningful escape from her daily struggles. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant chime of the church bell signaling the end of the day. Rosa, feeling a renewed sense of purpose from the brief respite, returned home with a tentative sense of optimism. However, this fragile comfort was quickly shattered the next morning. Upon waking, Rosa noticed an odd-sided door slightly ajar leading to Ruta's room. A cold wave of anxiety washed over her as she approached the door, which was usually kept tightly shut. With a mounting sense of dread, Rosa pushed the door open and found the room eerily empty. The bed, typically occupied by her sister, lay untouched, the blankets neatly arranged but devoid of its usual occupant. Rosa's heart pounded as she searched the house in a frantic search for Ruta, calling out her name into the empty rooms, but received no response. Her search led her to every corner of the house, each step echoing with a growing sense of desperation. The quiet of the home was unnervingly still, amplifying her growing fear. Finally, Rosa ventured outside, hoping against hope that Ruta might be somewhere in the yard or perhaps the barn. It was in the swine shed, a place typically associated with the smell of manure and the squeals of pigs, where Rosa's search concluded with a disturbing revelation. There, amidst the clutter and hay, Rosa discovered Ruta. Her sister sat on a low, rough-hewn wooden crate, clutching a sickly piglet close to her chest. The sight was both surreal and unsettling. Ruta's presence in the swine shed was alarming enough, but it was the image of her holding the sickly piglet that was particularly jarring. The tiny creature looked weak and frail, its eyes dull and its breathing labored. Ruta, in contrast, was oddly calm, her demeanor almost serene as she cradled the piglet with a tenderness that seemed out of place in such a grim setting. Rosa approached cautiously, her eyes fixed on Ruta's face, which was inscrutable in its calmness. "Ruta," she said softly, her voice trembling with concern, "what are you doing here? Why are you holding the piglet?" Ruta's response was unsettlingly detached. She looked up at Rosa with a vacant expression, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was cold," she said simply, as if that explained everything. Her gaze then returned to the piglet, her fingers gently stroking its shivering body. Rosa's heart raced as she absorbed the bizarre scene before her. The swine shed, usually a place of practical farming chores, had become an unsettling stage for Ruta's cryptic and troubling behavior. The sight of her sister, so out of place and so disconnected from the world around her, only added to the heavy atmosphere of dread that seemed to hang over the entire household. As Rosa helped Ruta back inside the house, the image of the sickly piglet and Ruta's strange tranquility haunted her thoughts. The lines between her sister's increasingly unpredictable actions and her own mounting fears began to blur, leaving Rosa feeling more isolated and fearful than ever before. The shadow of Ruta's enigmatic behavior loomed large, casting a dark pall over Rosa's already troubled existence. The discovery of the piglet's injuries was a chilling moment for Rosa and her father. The small creature, previously a symbol of the farm's modest vitality, now lay on a straw-covered bench in the barn, its delicate neck marred by disturbing puncture wounds. Rosa's father had noticed the injuries while tending to the animals and called Rosa over with a sense of urgency. As Rosa approached, she could see the wounds clearly. The marks were irregular, resembling deep, clawed punctures rather than the typical small bites associated with rats. The sight of them filled her with an uneasy dread. The father's face was etched with concern as he gently touched the injured piglet's neck, his fingers grimly tracing the angry red tracks that marred its skin. The marks were too large and too deliberate to be the work of rodents, and the nature of the injuries suggested something far more sinister. Without delay, Rosa's father decided to seek the opinion of the neighbor, a seasoned farmer known for his expertise in animal care. The neighbor, a grizzled man with a furrowed brow and a deep-set voice, examined the piglet with a practiced eye. His furrowed brow deepened as he scrutinized the wounds. "No, these aren't from rats," he finally said, his voice gravelly and dispassionate. "Rats usually leave smaller, more erratic bite marks. These look different, more like they've been inflicted by something else entirely." Rosa's father was visibly unsettled by the neighbor's assessment. "So what do you suggest we do?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. The neighbor's response was blunt and devoid of empathy. "The piglet's wounds are too severe. It's best to put it down. There's nothing more to be done. It's suffering too much." The gravity of the situation sank in as Rosa and her father took the neighbor's advice. The decision to end the piglet's suffering felt like a grim necessity, but it did nothing to ease the mounting tension in their home. That evening, during a somber dinner, Rosa tried to glean more information from Ruta. The dinner table was quiet, save for the clinking of cutlery and the muffled sounds of the house settling into the evening stillness. Rosa couldn't shake the troubling thoughts about the piglet and its mysterious injuries. Gathering her courage, Rosa broached the subject. "Ruta, where is the piglet?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral, though her heart pounded with anxiety. "I haven't seen it all day." Ruta, who had been sitting quietly, her eyes downcast, looked up slowly. Her expression was one of vague discomfort. I hid it," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "It wasn't well, so I thought it needed to be hidden." Rosa pressed further, trying to understand Ruta's vague and unsettling response. "But why did you hide it? And where did you put it?" Ruta's gaze shifted uneasily, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. "It needed to be alone," she said cryptically, avoiding direct eye contact. "I didn't want anyone to see it." Rosa's unease grew as she tried to interpret Ruta's words. Her sister's behavior was increasingly erratic and opaque, adding to the mounting sense of foreboding that seemed to envelop their household. The mystery of the piglet and Ruta's strange actions only deepened Rosa's fears as she struggled to piece together the unsettling puzzle of their troubled lives. The darkened room and the somber silence that followed only magnified Rosa's sense of isolation. As she glanced at Ruta, who remained eerily quiet and withdrawn, Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister lurked beneath the surface of their family's increasingly troubled existence. As the days progressed, Ruta's behavior became increasingly unsettling. Her mannerisms shifted from peculiar to outright disturbing. At dinner, she sat at the table with a hollow gaze, her eyes unfocused and distant. Rosa would try to engage her in conversation, but Ruta's responses were minimal and devoid of any real connection. After finishing her meal, Ruta would retreat to her room, where she lay on her bed in a rigid, unnatural pose. Her body seemed to be arranged meticulously, like a doll placed just so on a shelf. Rosa, peering through the crack of her door, felt a shiver crawl down her spine at the sight of her sister's unsettling stillness. The eerie atmosphere in the house was compounded by the strange noises Rosa began hearing at night. Despite the palpable quiet of the household after dark, Rosa was disturbed by the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways. These were not the soft, rhythmic footsteps of someone walking casually, rather, they were the deliberate, uneven steps of someone moving purposefully through the house. Rosa lay in her bed, clutching her blankets tightly, as she listened to the unsettling sounds of footsteps traversing from one room to another. The sounds seemed to grow louder as the night wore on, creating an oppressive sense of dread. One morning, the house was engulfed in a chilling silence. Rosa awoke to find Ruta's bed empty, the covers neatly made but with no sign of her sister. Panic gripped Rosa as she frantically searched the house, calling out for Ruta. Each room she checked was empty, the only signs of Ruta's presence being the lingering echoes of her footsteps from the previous night. The absence of the piglet and Ruta's deteriorating mental state were the least of Rosa's concerns when, later that day, she faced another terrifying blow. Her father, who had been growing increasingly despondent and withdrawn, suffered a heart attack. Rosa found him collapsed in the garage, his face contorted in pain and panic. The sight was horrifying, a stark reminder of the physical and emotional toll that the family's misfortunes had exacted. The urgency of the situation was overwhelming. An ambulance arrived swiftly, and Rosa's father was rushed to the hospital. The once familiar garage, filled with the comforting smell of machinery and the quiet hum of mechanical work, now felt like a scene from a nightmare. Rosa was left standing in the garage, the weight of her father's condition and the ever-deepening mystery surrounding Ruta pressing heavily on her shoulders. The gravity of her father's heart attack left Rosa feeling numb. Her father's hospitalization meant that she was now solely responsible for maintaining some semblance of normalcy at home, even as the strange occurrences and Ruta's erratic behavior continued to unravel the stability of her already fragile world. As days turned into weeks, the absence of the piglet and her father's prolonged stay in the hospital only deepened the sense of dread that clung to the house. Ruta's nighttime wanderings and eerie behavior grew more pronounced, as if she were being drawn into a shadowy realm from which there was no return. The isolation and fear Rosa felt became a constant companion, overshadowing every aspect of her life as she struggled to manage the house and grapple with the mounting terror of her sister's increasingly bizarre actions. With both her parents now hospitalized, Rosa found herself alone, shouldering the heavy burden of managing the household and caring for her increasingly unpredictable sister, Ruta. The once familiar rhythms of daily life had devolved into a chaotic scramble of responsibilities and anxieties. Rosa's days were consumed with the endless chores of running the household, feeding the animals, maintaining the property, and ensuring that the bills were paid. Her nights were filled with the additional strain of checking on Ruta, whose erratic behavior became a source of constant dread. Ruta's behavior had grown more peculiar and disconcerting with each passing day. She retreated into a world of her own, avoiding any meaningful interaction with Rosa. The previously vibrant and active sister now seemed like a shell of her former self. Her room was a reflection of her disturbed state, disheveled and filled with unsettling traces of her daily activities. Rosa found strange markings and smudges on the walls, the origin of which she could not decipher. The once orderly room had become a chaotic mess, with items scattered randomly and mysterious substances smeared on surfaces. The most alarming issue, however, was the troubling disappearance of the piglets. Rosa had always taken pride in caring for the animals on their farm, but now the livestock situation seemed to spiral out of control. One morning, she approached the pigsty with a sense of routine, only to find the pen eerily empty. The place where the piglets should have been was deserted, with no sign of their tiny hoofprints or their usual squeals. The realization that they had vanished overnight was both shocking and horrifying. Rosa searched frantically, her heart pounding in her chest. She scoured the nearby fields and barns, calling out for the piglets, but her calls were met with silence. The empty pigsty seemed like a stark reminder of the worsening state of their lives, adding to Rosa's mounting anxiety. The disappearance of the piglets not only represented a financial loss but also deepened her sense of isolation and helplessness. The farm, once a place of solace and security, now seemed like an abandoned relic of normalcy. The creeping sense of dread that accompanied Rosa's every step was palpable, and the unsettling quiet of the house only magnified her fears. The burden of managing everything alone while dealing with Ruta's increasingly strange behavior felt insurmountable. In her desperate attempts to maintain control, Rosa tried to keep the farm running and her sister's needs met. However, with every passing day, the strain of the situation began to take a toll on her physical and emotional well-being. The once thriving home now echoed with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional, eerie noises that seemed to emanate from Ruta's room or the empty corners of the house. Rosa's nights were plagued by insomnia as she lay awake, listening to the unsettling creaks and groans of the old house. The isolation and constant worry left her feeling hollow and exhausted. She felt as though she was teetering on the edge of her sanity, caught in a nightmarish cycle of managing a deteriorating home and caring for a sister whose actions grew more enigmatic and disturbing by the day. As Rosa struggled to maintain some semblance of normalcy in her deteriorating situation, the assistance from her neighbors became a small beacon of relief. They lent a hand with the farm chores and offered their support in any way they could. One neighbor, Mrs. Svetlana, brought over a basket of fresh produce and stayed to help with the animals, while Mr. Ivan, another local farmer, helped repair the broken fencing in the pigsty. Despite their efforts, the sense of unease surrounding the missing piglets remained unresolved. The participants of the village gathered to search for clues, but even the local constable, who was called in to investigate, found no trace of the animals. The constable's thorough inspection yielded no clues, and he was left scratching his head, adding to the mystery that clung to the property. As the nights grew longer and the atmosphere more oppressive, Rosa began experiencing unsettling phenomena that compounded her fears. She would lie in bed, the house silent save for the occasional creaks and groans of the old wooden structure. Yet, as the hours dragged on, she started to hear voices soft, murmuring conversations that seemed to drift through the darkened halls. The voices were indistinguishable at first, but as Rosa strained to listen, she began to recognize fragments of sentences where Ruta was speaking in a distressed tone, calling out for help from people who were not there. The voices seemed to come from different corners of the house, each whispering in a different tone, creating an eerie cacophony that left Rosa feeling like she was caught between the waking world and a nightmarish dream. The conversations often included pleas for assistance and cryptic requests, all of which intensified Rosa's anxiety. The voices would drift in and out of coherence, leaving her feeling as if she were trapped in a haunting reverie, unable to discern reality from the surreal. The unsettling dialogue created an atmosphere of dread, as Rosa felt as if the house itself were alive with sinister intent. To make matters worse, Rosa faced the crushing reality of her inability to visit her parents in the hospital. The constraints of time and her overwhelming responsibilities left her feeling utterly powerless. She had tried to make the journey several times, only to be thwarted by various obstacles: a broken cartwheel, a storm that made travel dangerous, and a series of personal setbacks that seemed to conspire against her. Each failed attempt to see her parents added to her sense of isolation and despair. The distance between her and the hospital, both physical and emotional, seemed to grow with every passing day. The separation from her parents only deepened her loneliness and frustration. Rosa longed for their support and guidance, but their absence left her feeling adrift. The strange occurrences in the house and the eerie voices that filled her nights served as a constant reminder of how far her life had spiraled from the comfort and safety she once knew. The weight of her responsibilities, coupled with the growing sense of dread, cast a dark shadow over her days, leaving her on the edge of breaking down under the relentless strain of her nightmarish reality. The attic, once a forgotten space cluttered with old memories and abandoned belongings, had recently become a site of increasing unease. Ruta had been spending more and more time there, her behavior growing ever more cryptic and unsettling. One evening, Rosa, driven by mounting worry and curiosity, decided to investigate the strange happenings for herself. As Rosa approached the attic, she noticed a light flickering under the door, its glow casting eerie shadows on the worn floorboards. Pushing the door open with a creak, she was met with a chilling sight. Ruta was sitting in the middle of the attic, surrounded by piles of old fabric and half-finished knitting projects. A man, one of the local tradesmen who had been working nearby, was helping Ruta with some of the heavier items. Suddenly, the man stumbled, his foot catching on a loose board. He let out a startled cry as he fell, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Rosa's heart raced as she rushed to the attic, only to find Ruta sitting motionless, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor, as if she hadn't even noticed the commotion. In the days following the incident, Rosa's anxiety grew as strange occurrences continued to plague the house. At night, the attic would come alive with a cacophony of unsettling noises, scratching sounds, thumps, and what sounded like footsteps moving across the wooden floors. Rosa would lie awake, her heart pounding, as the noises seemed to grow louder and more insistent. The eerie sounds often coincided with Ruta's mysterious behavior, adding to Rosa's growing sense of dread. Ruta's behavior was increasingly bizarre. She would speak in hushed tones to unseen companions, her conversations filled with cryptic messages and incomprehensible murmurs. The sight of her furrowed brow and intense concentration as she worked on her knitting only heightened Rosa's unease. Ruta was secretive about her projects, often hiding her work when Rosa entered the room and locking her door behind her. The air around Ruta seemed charged with an inexplicable tension, and the normally warm and loving sister seemed to have transformed into a stranger. The situation reached a critical point one fateful afternoon when disaster struck. A group of local boys, playing near the edge of the property, accidentally set fire to some dry brush and debris. The flames quickly grew out of control, racing towards the old wooden fence and spreading rapidly. As the fire roared closer to the house, the wind carried the sparks, and soon, the blaze was licking at the exterior walls of the home. Rosa's heart pounded in her chest as she saw the smoke curling up from the backyard. Panic surged through her as she realized the house was in imminent danger. She raced to the attic to find Ruta, but the sight that greeted her was both terrifying and surreal. Ruta stood in the middle of the room, staring vacantly at the flames visible through the attic window. The heat was intense, and the flames were beginning to breach the roof. Rosa shouted at Ruta to follow her, but Ruta's response was eerily calm and detached. With the fire threatening to engulf the house, Rosa managed to grab Ruta and drag her down the stairs, the smoke choking their breaths and the heat making each step more arduous. They stumbled outside, where Rosa saw the flames consuming the house, casting a hellish glow over the landscape. The neighboring farmers and townsfolk had arrived with buckets of water and makeshift tools, working desperately to contain the fire. Rosa joined them, her hands trembling as she threw water onto the encroaching blaze, her mind racing with thoughts of her family and the devastation that was unfolding before her eyes. The fire eventually died down, leaving behind a smoldering ruin. The house, once a haven of familiarity, was now a charred skeleton of its former self. Rosa and Ruta, covered in soot and ash, stood amidst the wreckage, the weight of their loss heavy upon them. The disaster had left them not only with physical scars, but with deep emotional wounds, as the house and its secrets had been consumed by the unforgiving flames. The loss of their home marked the end of an era, and the future loomed uncertain and bleak, shrouded in the shadows of the past and the mysteries of Ruta's troubled mind. Ruta's demise was the culmination of a series of unsettling and tragic events. The fire had claimed her life, suffocating her in the thick, choking smoke that had filled the house. Yet, as investigators pieced together the remnants of the attic, a far more disturbing truth emerged about her final moments. Amidst the charred debris, they discovered the horrifying extent of Ruta's mental breakdown. In a desperate and grotesque act of self-mutilation, she had attempted to sever her own arms. The act was not merely an act of violence against herself, but a bizarre attempt to transform into what she saw as a monster. This tragic revelation painted a bleak picture of Ruta's psychological state, her mind unraveling in the throes of despair and madness. Rosa was left to grapple with the devastating aftermath of the fire and her sister's gruesome death. Her physical injuries were severe, with burns and smoke inhalation, causing her both immediate and long-term health issues. However, it was the psychological trauma that weighed heaviest on her. The nightmare of the fire, the sight of Ruta's mutilated body, and the subsequent chaos left Rosa in a state of deep psychological distress. The hospital became a sanctuary, though a grim one, where Rosa's suffering was attended to. She faced not only the pain of her injuries, but also the profound shock of her sister's actions and the eerie, lingering effects of the horror she had witnessed. Nightmares plagued her sleep, and the mental scars of her experiences would continue to impact her long after her physical wounds had healed. As authorities delved into the investigation, the true extent of the horror that had unfolded at the house began to surface. The attic, which had been the epicenter of the family's nightmare, yielded disturbing evidence. Among the charred ruins, investigators uncovered grotesque artifacts, masks made from the skin of pigs, and dismembered body parts that did not correspond to any known individuals. The discovery of these macabre items provoked a wave of shock and disbelief within the community. The masks, crafted from the skin of pigs, were crudely made, their grotesque nature suggesting a dark, ritualistic purpose. They were a chilling testament to the twisted events that had transpired within the walls of the house. The human remains, dismembered and unidentifiable, added another layer of horror, raising questions about their origin and the circumstances surrounding their presence. The investigation stirred public fear and fascination, with the townspeople grappling to make sense of the grim findings. Speculation ran rampant as people tried to connect the dots between Ruta's erratic behavior, the strange artifacts, and the tragic events. The police struggled to piece together a coherent narrative from the disturbing evidence, while Rosa, already shattered by her experiences, faced the scrutiny and suspicion of a community struggling to comprehend the horror that had unfolded in their midst. In the end, the investigation revealed a chilling story of madness, mutilation, and mystery, leaving the community with unanswered questions and a deep sense of unease. The tragic end of Ruta, the profound psychological impact on Rosa, and the horrifying discoveries made in the attic formed a grim tableau of horror that would linger in the memories of all who had been touched by the tragedy. The chilling revelations about Ruta's actions became a dark epilogue to the horrifying events that had unfolded. As Rosa began to piece together the fragments of her shattered world, she faced an overwhelming realization about her sister's sinister activities. The discovery of grotesque artifacts and the macabre nature of the crimes revealed the depths of Ruta's descent into madness. It became clear that Ruta had been hiding more than just her physical suffering. She had been concealing a trail of unimaginable horror. The police reports, combined with Rosa's own painful recollections, painted a grim picture of Ruta's actions. The masks crafted from pigskin and the dismembered human remains uncovered in the attic were not just bizarre relics but gruesome evidence of a series of murders. Ruta had taken lives in a grotesque ritual of vengeance, or for reasons that defied rational explanation. It seemed that the psychological torment she had endured was channeled into a horrifying spree of violence, driven by motives that remained murky and deeply unsettling. The protagonist arrived at the old family home in the dead of winter, a biting chill in the air matching the unease in his heart. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached the front door, each step stirring memories of a childhood now cloaked in shadows. The house stood as it always had, yet there was an undeniable sense of unfamiliarity and detachment. The once warm and inviting facade now appeared cold and foreboding, like a relic of a forgotten past. Nadia greeted him at the door, her smile warm but tinged with the resentment of years gone by. "Finally decided to visit, huh?" she said, her voice a mix of relief and reproach. Her eyes bore into him, seeking answers to questions left unasked for too long. Beside her stood Yasha, his niece, who had grown significantly since the last time he saw her. She gazed up at him with curious eyes, not immediately recognizing the man she once called uncle. "Hey, Yashia," he said softly, crouching to her level. The little girl hesitated before offering a shy smile, the recognition slowly dawning in her eyes. Inside, the house felt thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Every corner seemed to whisper secrets, every shadow held a memory. The protagonist and Nadia sat in the living room, the silence between them a palpable entity. The ticking of the old grandfather clock echoed through the room, marking time that felt both infinite and fleeting. The protagonist glanced around, his eyes lingering on the worn photographs lining the mantelpiece. Faces from the past stared back at him, their smiles frozen in moments of happiness that now felt like cruel taunts. The anticipation of seeing their parents again gnawed at him, each second stretching out in agonizing uncertainty. Nadia broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've missed you, you know." We all have her words hung in the air, a fragile bridge extending across the chasm that had formed between them over the years. He nodded, unable to find the right words to respond. His mind raced with the weight of what lay ahead, the memories of past arguments and misunderstandings flooding back with a vengeance. The walls seemed to close in on him, the house transforming into a maze of regret and lost time. Nadia reached out and took his hand, her grip firm yet comforting. "We'll get through this," she said, her eyes meeting his with a mix of determination and hope. "Together." As they sat there, the sound of footsteps above signaled the approach of their parents. The protagonist's heart pounded in his chest, a sense of dread mingling with a flicker of hope. The moment of reunion was upon them, and with it, the chance to confront the ghosts of their past. The house, with all its memories and secrets, seemed to watch silently, waiting to see if this family could find a way to heal the wounds that had kept them apart for so long. Entering the kitchen, the protagonist found his father seated in his customary chair by the window, the morning light casting a pale glow over his worn features. The old man looked up, a flicker of recognition and relief in his eyes, but his demeanor remained calm, almost resigned. It was clear that the years had taken their toll. He seemed diminished, both in body and spirit, a shadow of the once robust figure who had loomed so large in the protagonist's childhood. "Hello, Dad," he greeted, his voice catching slightly. The older man nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Good to see you, son," his father replied, though his voice was weak. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken words and mutual understanding of the difficult conversation that lay ahead. The mention of their mother was conspicuously absent, and it wasn't long before Nadia offered an explanation. "Mom's not feeling well," she said quietly. "She's resting in her room." A pang of guilt and worry struck the protagonist's heart. He had known, of course, that his mother's health was declining, but the reality of it was more stark and painful than he had prepared for. The thought of her alone and unwell, while he had been absent, filled him with a deep sense of remorse. His footsteps felt heavier as he moved towards her room, the door slightly ajar, as if inviting him to step inside, yet also warning him of the frailty within. As he stood in the doorway, looking at his mother's frail form resting on the bed, memories of his childhood flooded back. The house, once a sanctuary of laughter and love, now seemed to echo with the specters of those happier times. He remembered running through these halls, his mother's laughter ringing out, his father's strong, reassuring presence always nearby. But now, all he had were memories, tinged with regret and a painful awareness of his own failures. His life, marked by missed opportunities and a string of disappointments, felt inadequate and shameful in the face of his family's enduring love and sacrifice. He had nothing to show for his time away, no achievements to make his parents proud, no successes to soften the blow of his prolonged absence. As he stood there, The realization hit him with a cold, hard clarity. He had squandered the time that could have been spent with his family, seeking solace in fleeting distractions and empty pursuits. The life he had led, marked by turmoil and setbacks, now seemed even more futile in the light of his parents' deteriorating health and the undeniable love they still held for him despite everything. The protagonist felt a wave of unease and helplessness wash over him as the stark reality of his homecoming set in. His idealistic dreams of a triumphant return had been shattered, replaced by the harsh truth of his parents' frailty and the palpable tension in the air. He had envisioned a warm, celebratory reunion, a moment of pride and accomplishment, but instead he found himself grappling with disappointment and regret. His fantasies of prosperity and success seemed pitifully naive in the face of the struggles his family had endured during his absence. Later that evening, the issue of sleeping arrangements came up. His mother, too ill to move around much, had taken over his old room. This left the protagonist with the only option of sleeping in the living room. His father explained the situation with a mixture of apology and firmness. "I can't sleep on that sofa," his father said, his voice weary. "My back just won't handle it," the protagonist nodded, understanding but also feeling a pang of sadness. The living room, once a place of family gatherings and shared stories, now felt cold and impersonal, a far cry from the comfort of his childhood bedroom. He unfolded the old, worn-out couch, trying to make it as comfortable as possible. The cushions were lumpy and uneven, and the smell of must and old fabric lingered in the air. As he lay down, he felt a profound sense of displacement, as if he no longer fit into the life he had left behind. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant, muffled sounds of his parents moving about. Unable to find solace or sleep, the protagonist's thoughts churned with a tumult of emotions. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on him, the tension and awkwardness proving too much to bear. Seeking an escape, he quietly slipped out of the house, taking care not to wake anyone. The cold night air hit him like a jolt, sharp and bracing, as he made his way to his car. Inside the car, he sat for a moment, savoring the solitude and the temporary reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere of the house. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, unscrewing the cap with shaky hands. The first sip burned his throat, but it brought a rush of warmth and a fleeting sense of relief. He took another and another, the alcohol numbing the edges of his anxiety and guilt. As he drank, his mind wandered, replaying scenes from his past, mingling memories of happier times with the harsh realities of the present. He felt a deep, gnawing sense of failure, a realization that he had let his family down in ways that could never be fully rectified. The darkness outside the car window seemed to press in on him, mirroring the despair that threatened to engulf him from within. The protagonist knew he was running away, hiding from the pain rather than confronting it. But for now, the solace of the bottle and the isolation of the night were all he could manage. He stared out into the void, the shadows shifting and twisting, as if the ghosts of his past were dancing just beyond the reach of the dim car light. The cold silence of the night enveloped him, offering a temporary refuge from the overwhelming emotions that awaited him inside the house. Sitting alone in his car, the protagonist's mind drifted back to memories of the house and the family who had built it. He remembered his father tirelessly working to expand their modest home into the cottage it was now, brick by brick, over many long years. The transformation was not just physical, it represented the strength, dedication, and hope his father carried for their family. Each extension and renovation held stories of perseverance and sacrifice, of a man determined to provide a better life for his loved ones despite the relentless challenges they faced. These recollections stirred a complex mix of emotions within him. He felt a profound respect for his father's unyielding spirit and a deep-seated pain from witnessing the relentless struggles they endured. The house, once a symbol of his father's hard work and ambition, now stood as a reminder of the hardships that had taken their toll on all of them. It was a monument to both triumph and suffering, embodying the bittersweet essence of their family history. As he sat brooding, the sound of approaching footsteps snapped him from his reverie. Nadia appeared at the car window, her face a blend of concern and determination. Without a word, she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat beside him. She glanced at the bottle of whiskey, then at her brother, understanding the need for an escape from the oppressive reality inside the house. "You're not alone, you know," she said softly, taking the bottle from him and taking a sip herself. The warmth of the alcohol spread through her, mirroring the fragile warmth of their renewed connection. "I know," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I just needed a moment. Everything feels so heavy." Nadia nodded, her eyes reflecting the same weariness. "It's been hard for all of us. But we're here now, together. That's what matters." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared burdens hanging in the air between them. The memories of their childhood, the struggles, the rare moments of joy all came flooding back. They spoke quietly, their words tumbling out in fits and starts, as they opened up about the difficulties they faced and the pain they had carried alone for so long. "I remember when Dad was building the extension," Nadia said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "He would come home exhausted, but he never gave up. He wanted so much for us, even if it meant breaking himself in the process." The protagonist nodded, the memory vivid in his mind. "I always admired him for that, but sometimes I wonder if we asked too much of him. If I asked too much." Nadia placed a comforting hand on his arm. "We were just kids. It wasn't our fault. We did the best we could with what we had." The protagonist looked at his sister, seeing the resilience and strength that mirrored their father's. "I wish I had been stronger, more successful, something to make them proud." "You're here now," Nadia said firmly. "That's what they need, what we need. We can't change the past, but we can face the future together." As they shared the bottle and their thoughts, the night seemed to grow a little less cold. The shadows that had haunted the protagonist's mind began to recede, replaced by a tentative hope. They had been through so much, but the bond of family, strained though it was, still held them together. The car, once a refuge of solitude, became a place of reconnection and understanding. The protagonist realized that despite the ghosts of the past, there was still a chance for healing and redemption. Together, he and Nadia could face the challenges ahead, and perhaps in time, find peace in the house that held so many memories. As they sat in the car, the conversation drifted to lighter topics. The protagonist mentioned Yashia, his niece, and how much she had grown since he last saw her. "Yashia," he said thoughtfully. "That's a unique name. How did you decide on it?" Nadia smiled, a hint of pride in her eyes. "I wanted something that felt both modern and meaningful. Yashia is short for Yasmina. It's beautiful, isn't it?" "It is," he agreed, then chuckled softly. "I remember when we were kids we had such different ideas about names. Do you remember how you always wanted to name your future kids after cartoon characters?" Nadia laughed, the sound a welcome break from the tension. "Oh God, yes. I think I wanted a daughter named She-Ra and a son named He-Man. Can you imagine?" They both laughed, the shared memory bringing a fleeting moment of warmth. "I suppose our tastes have evolved since then," he said. "Do you have any other names in mind for future children?" Nadia nodded. "I've thought about it a lot. I like names that are timeless but not too common. For a girl, maybe Anastasia. For a boy, maybe Alexander. Strong names with a sense of history." The conversation soon turned back to their parents and the current situation. Nadia's expression grew more serious, her eyes reflecting the concern she felt. "It's been tough with Mom and Dad," she admitted. "Especially with Mom's health declining. Dad tries to be strong, but you can see how much it's wearing him down. I feel guilty for not being here," the protagonist confessed, "for leaving you to handle it all." Nadia shook her head. "It's not your fault. We all made choices. But it's been lonely. Sometimes I think they called us back because they're scared. Scared of dying alone. Scared of what comes next." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Do you think that's why they asked us to come? Not just out of love, but out of fear?" Nadia sighed. "I do. They're getting older. They need us now more than ever. But it's more than just needing company. They need help. They need caretakers." A shadow of doubt crossed his mind, and he voiced the suspicion that had been nagging at him. "Do you ever think there's more to it? That maybe they called us back because of other reasons?" Nadia glanced at him sharply. You mean like inheritance? Or making sure we're here to take over when they can't manage anymore? Exactly, he said, the bitterness clear in his tone. It feels like there's more than just a sudden burst of parental affection. There's a sense of urgency, like they're making sure everything is in order. Nadia looked away, her expression troubled. I've thought about it too. It's hard not to, given our history. The way things have been strained for so long. It's difficult to trust their motives completely. He nodded, the familiar feeling of mistrust settling in. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But it's hard to shake the feeling that there's an agenda. Something more than just wanting us close. Nadia sighed, leaning back in her seat. We have to be careful. Whatever their reasons, we need to protect ourselves. Make sure we're not being manipulated. The protagonist looked at his sister, appreciating her strength and resilience. We'll get through this, Nadia. Together, no matter what their reasons are, we'll face it head on. The night around them seemed to hold its breath, the weight of their suspicions and unresolved emotions pressing in. In the darkness, surrounded by memories and fears, they found a fragile sense of unity, a shared resolve to confront whatever lay ahead. The house, with its looming presence, waited silently, a witness to the unfolding drama of a family struggling to find its way back to each other amidst shadows of doubt and fear. As the night wore on and the bottle of whiskey grew lighter, Nadia's demeanor shifted. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice tinged with both guilt and pragmatism. You know, I've been thinking about something, she began, staring out into the darkened yard. With the way things are. The house, I mean. It's in a prime location. If we were to sell it, it could be quite lucrative. The protagonist looked at her, a mixture of surprise and curiosity on his face. Sell the house. What are you thinking? Nadia sighed, her expression conflicted. After the divorce, things have been tough. Raising Yasha on my own isn't easy. If we inherit the house, selling it could provide a significant financial cushion. It's not just about the money, it's about security for Yasha and me. He nodded slowly, understanding her plight. I get it. It's a practical solution. But it feels so cold, thinking about it that way. I know, Nadia admitted, but we have to be realistic. They're not going to be around forever. We need to think about our future too. After discussing Nadia's practical concerns, they shifted the conversation to logistics. We need to maintain appearances, Nadia said. If we're too obvious, it might raise suspicions. What if we take turns visiting them? One of us comes every 2 months. That way, we're present, but not overly so. The protagonist considered this. It makes sense. We can show we care without being here all the time. Plus, it gives us time to manage our own lives. We'll look responsible and attentive. Exactly, Nadia agreed. It's a compromise. We play the long game, keep things civil, and hopefully when the time comes, we'll be in a good position. They sat in silence for a while, the plan taking shape in their minds. The pragmatism of their strategy felt necessary, but it also left a bitter taste, a stark reminder of the complex and strained relationship they had with their parents. As the night grew colder, they found themselves reminiscing about their childhood, the conversation taking a darker turn. The protagonist's gaze became distant as he recalled the harsh treatment they had endured. Do you remember how Dad used to discipline you, as he asked quietly, his voice tinged with the remnants of old pain? Nadia nodded, her face hardening at the memories. He was so strict. Any small mistake, and he'd lash out. The belt, the stick, whatever was at hand. The physical pain was one thing, but it was the fear that stayed with us. And Mom, the protagonist added, his voice bitter. Her punishments were different. Psychological. She'd humiliate us, make us feel worthless. Those cutting remarks, the constant belittling. It was like she enjoyed breaking us down. Nadia shivered, the memories casting a pall over the car. I remember once I failed a test at school. She didn't just scold me, she called me a disgrace, said I was destined to be a failure. Those words, they never really go away. Yeah, he agreed, the weight of their shared trauma heavy in the confined space. It's no wonder we're so messed up. We grew up in a house of horrors, pretending everything was fine. Nadia looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "We can't change the past, but we can try to control the future. Maybe, by dealing with this now, we can finally find some peace." The protagonist nodded, feeling a semblance of resolve. "We owe it to ourselves, and to Yasha. She deserves better than we had." As they sat in the cold car, the siblings found a renewed sense of purpose amidst the shadows of their past. The house, with all its haunting memories and hidden pains, stood as both a reminder of their suffering and a potential key to their future. They knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but together they could face whatever darkness lay ahead. As the protagonist sat in his car, trying to process the weight of the conversation with Nadia, he noticed a movement by the fence. Squinting through the dim light, he recognized the familiar figure of Aunt Nona, their childhood neighbor. She stood there, partially concealed by the overgrown hedge, watching him with a curious, almost suspicious gaze. For a moment he considered acknowledging her, waving or saying hello, but something held him back. The memories of this place, the haunting recollections of their childhood, made him hesitant. Instead, he simply watched her. After a few moments, she seemed to sense his reluctance and turned away, disappearing back into the shadows of her own yard. He couldn't shake the feeling that her watchful eyes had seen more than he was comfortable with. The next morning, the house was filled with tension even before the sun had fully risen. The protagonist was jolted awake by raised voices coming from the hallway. He quickly got up and made his way toward the commotion, finding Nadia in a heated argument with their father. "How dare you," Nadia shouted, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you lay a hand on my daughter?" Their father, looking defensive and irritated, responded gruffly, "She shouldn't have been in there. She knows better than to go into our room without permission." "What did you do?" the protagonist asked, stepping between them to diffuse the situation. Nadia, trembling with rage, pointed an accusing finger at their father. He grabbed Yasha and dragged her out of their room. She was crying, terrified. Their father's face hardened. "I didn't hurt her. She needs to learn boundaries." "She's just a child," Nadia shot back. "You don't need to be so harsh. You don't have the right to treat her like that." The argument left a heavy cloud over the household. The protagonist and Nadia both felt the suffocating tension, the old wounds from their past mingling with the new conflicts of the present. As the day wore on, Nadia's protectiveness over her daughter grew more pronounced. "I think she was drawn to the room because of that old TV," Nadia mused later, her voice shaky with residual anger. "Mom and Dad always had it on, even when they were resting. It must have caught her attention." The protagonist nodded, remembering the small, ancient television set in their parents' bedroom. It had been a fixture of their childhood, a source of both comfort and control. Their parents would sit in front of it for hours, the flickering screen casting eerie shadows on the walls. The memory of its droning sound still made him uneasy. As night fell, the siblings found themselves whispering in the dimly lit kitchen, trying to make sense of the day's events. "I feel like we're walking on eggshells here," the protagonist said. "Every moment is tense, like something is about to snap." Nadia sighed, her eyes weary. "This house, it's like it's feeding on our fear and anger. We came here thinking we could handle it, but it's like we're back to being those scared kids again." They both knew that their parents' home, with all its haunted memories and unresolved tensions, was a battleground of emotions. The old house seemed to amplify their anxieties, each creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind a reminder of the unresolved darkness that lingered within its walls. Despite their shared resolve, the siblings couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The oppressive atmosphere of the house pressed down on them, a silent testament to the pain and secrets that had festered there for so long. As they prepared for another restless night, they knew that the days ahead would test their strength and their bond, pushing them to confront the ghosts of their past in ways they had never imagined. The day dragged on, each hour seeming to stretch interminably. Outside, a thick blanket of snow fell steadily, its silence adding to the sense of isolation and timelessness that permeated the house. The heavy snowfall obscured the world beyond the windows, creating a cocoon of cold and quiet. Nadia and Yassia stayed mostly in their room, the door closed, as if to create a barrier between themselves and the rest of the house. Their father occupied himself in the kitchen, the sound of pots and pans clanging occasionally breaking the oppressive silence. The protagonist wandered aimlessly from room to room, feeling the weight of unresolved family issues pressing down on him, every creak of the floorboards a reminder of the house's suffocating grip. When they finally gathered for a meal, the atmosphere was stifling. The family sat around the table in a heavy, oppressive silence. No one seemed willing or able to break the tension that hung thick in the air. The protagonist glanced around, noting the strained expressions and averted eyes. He felt a deep sense of unease and futility, questioning the purpose of his visit. Yet a sense of duty and obligation kept him rooted to his seat, enduring the uncomfortable silence. The meal progressed without conversation, each bite feeling like a chore rather than sustenance. The protagonist's mind wandered, contemplating the strained relationships and unspoken resentments that had brought them to this point. He felt a gnawing discomfort, an underlying dread that something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't quite place it. As the day began to wane and the light outside dimmed to a wintry twilight, there came a knock at the door. The sound was unexpected and almost startling in the quiet house. Nadia, visibly relieved for a distraction, went to answer it. The door creaked open to reveal Aunt Nona, bundled against the cold, a bright smile lighting up her face. "Nona," Nadia exclaimed, genuine warmth and surprise in her voice. The protagonist felt a wave of nostalgia wash over him at the sight of their childhood neighbor. Aunt Nona had always been a comforting presence, a beacon of kindness in their tumultuous upbringing. "Nadia, it's been too long," Nona replied, stepping into the warmth of the house. Her presence seemed to bring with it a sense of life and energy that had been sorely missing. The protagonist joined them, a smile breaking through his brooding expression. "Aunt Nona, it's so good to see you." Nona's eyes sparkled with affection as she hugged him. "Look at you, all grown up. It's wonderful to be here with you both." Her visit immediately lightened the atmosphere. Nona's cheerful demeanor and genuine warmth were like a breath of fresh air in the stale, tense environment. She chatted animatedly, sharing stories and reminiscing about the old days, her laughter a soothing balm to their frayed nerves. Aunt Nona carefully retrieved a straw doll from her bag and presented it to Yazia, whose eyes widened in admiration. The doll, intricately woven and crafted with love, symbolized the kindness and care that the protagonist and Nadia's children had been deprived of in their own upbringing. Yazia clutched the doll close, a rare smile spreading across her face as she marveled at the gift's delicate craftsmanship. As they sat together, Aunt Nona turned to Nadia with a curious expression. "Nadia, what are your plans for the future? Have you thought about having more children?" The protagonist felt a pang of discomfort at the question, sensing the weight behind it. He shifted uneasily, attempting to deflect the topic. "We haven't made any definite plans yet," he replied vaguely, his eyes briefly meeting Nadia's before looking away. The uncertainty about their future, compounded by the complexities of their past, hung heavily in the air. That night, the protagonist was plagued by a harrowing nightmare that dredged up memories he had long tried to bury. In the dream, he found himself back in the cold, dimly lit corridors of his childhood home. The air was thick with fear and resentment as he faced the haunting specter of his parents' cruelty. His father's voice echoed with anger and disappointment, his mother's words cutting deeper than any physical pain. The dream replayed moments of harsh punishment and emotional abuse, each scene a stark reminder of the trauma they had endured as children. The protagonist watched helplessly as his younger self and Nadia were subjected to relentless cruelty, their innocence shattered by the ones who were supposed to protect them. In the midst of the nightmare, symbolic figures of their neighbors appeared as silent observers, their eyes cold and indifferent. Their presence added to the protagonist's overwhelming sense of vulnerability and isolation, as if the entire community had turned a blind eye to their suffering. He woke in a cold sweat, heart racing, the terror of the dream still vivid in his mind. The nightmare had peeled back layers of pain and fear, exposing the deep-seated wounds that had shaped his life. As he lay awake in the darkness, the oppressive weight of the past hung heavy on his chest, a reminder that some scars never truly healed. The protagonist woke with a start from his own nightmare, only to find Yasha standing in the doorway of his room. She clutched the straw doll Aunt Nona had given her, her eyes wide with fear. Before he could speak, Yasha whispered in a trembling voice, "I want to die." Shock and horror gripped the protagonist as he tried to comprehend the weight of Yasha's words. His heart raced with a mixture of fear and concern for his niece, whose innocent vulnerability struck a painful chord deep within him. Yasha's words hinted at a hidden threat emanating from the protagonist's parents, causing him to shudder with dread. She expressed her fear that their grandparents might do something terrible to her, highlighting the enduring impact of their cruelty on the next generation. This revelation cast a chilling shadow over the already tense atmosphere in the family home. In her heightened state of distress, Yasha uttered alarming words that pierced through the protagonist's heart. "Everyone would be better off without me," she whispered, her voice quivering with raw emotion. The weight of Yasha's statement shook the protagonist to the core, emphasizing the severity of her emotional turmoil and her perception of her place within the family dynamic. It underscored the deep-seated wounds inflicted by their parents' cruelty, now manifesting in haunting ways in Yasha's young mind. As the protagonist struggled to find the right words of comfort and reassurance, he realized the urgent need to protect Yasha from the shadows of their past that continued to haunt their lives. The conversation with Yasha was abruptly interrupted by Nadia's sleepy voice calling out for her daughter, causing the frightened girl to dart away. The creak of the door closing behind her echoed ominously in the protagonist's ears, intensifying his sense of unease and heightening his concern for Yasha's well-being. The next morning, over a somber breakfast in the kitchen, the protagonist and Nadia discussed the strange and troubling events of the past days. Nadia mentioned Yasha's odd behavior, noting how she seemed to hear things and react strangely, behavior she had not exhibited before. The protagonist's unease deepened as he pondered the implications of Yasha's distressing words and actions, grappling with the unsettling realization that their family's troubled history was now impacting another generation. After a tense deliberation, Nadia and the protagonist made a mutual decision to leave the following day. The visit to their parents had proven to be more disquieting and discomforting than they had anticipated, leaving them with a pervasive feeling of unease and a longing for the comfort of their own lives. The decision brought a mixture of relief and hope for the protagonist and Nadia, a sense of reclaiming control over their lives and escaping the oppressive atmosphere that had engulfed them during their stay. As they prepared to depart, they held on to the belief that leaving would bring them closer to a semblance of normalcy, away from the haunting memories and unresolved tensions that continued to haunt their family's home. The morning breakfast was interrupted by Aunt Nona's unexpected visit, claiming she had come simply to visit the protagonist's mother. Despite warnings not to disturb her, Aunt Nona insisted she would only stay a minute and proceeded upstairs. Curiosity and growing unease led the protagonist to eavesdrop on Aunt Nona's conversation through the door of the parents' bedroom. To his dismay, Aunt Nona spoke of strange and unsettling things, mentioning death and witchcraft in hushed tones. Her cryptic words sent a shiver down his spine, stirring up a deep-seated fear that something malevolent lurked within the walls of the house. After his unsettling encounter with Aunt Nona, the protagonist's sense of unease and foreboding escalated. The atmosphere in the house felt increasingly tense and fraught with danger. His instincts screamed at him to leave as soon as possible, to escape the growing shadow of fear that enveloped him. As he packed their belongings hurriedly, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Aunt Nona's visit than met the eye, that her cryptic words held a dark significance he couldn't fully grasp. The urgency to depart grew stronger with each passing moment, driving him to ensure they would soon leave this place behind, hoping to find solace and safety away from the ominous presence that had tainted their family home. The hero's father appeared completely withdrawn and unresponsive, leaving both the protagonist and Nadia disappointed. Their efforts to reconnect with him felt futile, adding to the sense of disillusionment that permeated their visit. Exhausted and emotionally drained, the protagonist sought solace in a bottle of brandy retrieved from the car's glove compartment. Hoping it would help him endure until morning, he relied on the numbing effects of alcohol to momentarily alleviate his distress. Aunt Nona once again raised suspicions with her late-night departure. Her secretive behavior fueled the protagonist's growing unease, prompting him to discuss his concerns with Nadia. He felt a pressing need to unravel the mysteries surrounding Aunt Nona's actions, sensing that there was more to her visits than mere familial concern. As the night wore on, shadows seemed to stretch ominously across the old family home, deepening the sense of unease that gripped the protagonist's heart. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were caught in the midst of something unsettling and potentially dangerous, driven by Aunt Nona's enigmatic presence and her cryptic behaviors. Each development intensified the protagonist's resolve to confront the unsettling truths lurking beneath the surface, even as he grappled with his own mounting fears and the urgent need to protect himself and his loved ones from the looming shadows of their family's past. The protagonist stumbled upon the realization that the small door beneath the staircase, always strictly forbidden to open, now stood ajar. This discovery sent a wave of intense worry and curiosity coursing through him. Descending into the cellar, the protagonist uncovered a hidden room filled with herbs, vials, and books, a sight that left him utterly shocked. This confirmed his suspicions of strange and sinister activities unfolding within the house. Nadia and the protagonist unearthed books containing spells, symbols, and descriptions of rituals, leading them to speculate that their mother might have practiced witchcraft and cast curses. The unsettling realization dawned upon them that their mother's involvement in occult practices could explain the eerie and unsettling atmosphere that pervaded their family home. As they pored over the mysterious texts, deciphering cryptic passages and unsettling illustrations, the air around them seemed to thicken with an otherworldly presence, heightening their sense of dread and apprehension. Each revelation peeled back another layer of the enigma shrouding their family's dark secrets, leaving them to grapple with the terrifying implications of what they had uncovered in the hidden depths of their own home. The protagonist, grappling with the anguish of infertility, accuses his mother, feeling a profound sense of pain and betrayal. Finding validation in the books, he realizes his mother might have intentionally harmed him using magic. Nadia uncovers in one of the books information about dolls used to designate individuals destined for sacrifice. The doll must be handed to a trusted person for the emissary of darkness to recognize who is marked for sacrifice. The protagonist and Nadia begin to suspect Aunt Nona of malicious intent. Overcome with rage, Nadia decides abruptly to retrieve Sasha and leave without saying goodbye to their relatives. As they hastily pack their belongings and prepare to depart, the air in the house thickens with a palpable sense of malevolence. Every shadow seems to conceal unseen threats, and the weight of their discoveries presses heavily upon them. The revelation of the doll, as a symbol of sacrifice, adds a chilling layer to their growing terror, fueling their determination to escape the ominous influence that now seemed to pervade every corner of their once familiar home. Their frantic departure is marked by a sense of urgency and dread, driven by the realization that they may have been unwitting pawns in a dark ritual woven into the fabric of their family's history. The specter of Aunt Nona's involvement looms ominously, leaving unanswered questions and a lingering fear of the unknown as they flee the haunting presence that had ensnared them within its web of secrets and sorcery. As the night dragged on, the main character found himself restless on the uncomfortable couch, unable to drift into sleep. His mind was consumed with thoughts of the bizarre discoveries and the faint murmurs that seemed to originate from the second floor, where he suspected Asenia was once again awake. Driven by a gnawing sense of unease, he made his way upstairs to investigate. There, he discovered his mother's door slightly ajar. Muffled whispers escaped into the hallway, but as he cautiously approached, an unsettling silence suddenly engulfed the room. Inside, the television emitted an eerie white noise, casting a surreal glow in the dimly lit space. His mother's demeanor was unsettling as she spoke to him, addressing him with an unusual tenderness as "my boy" and hinting at an imminent event with cryptic remarks. Abruptly, she closed the door in his face, heightening his growing sense of dread and the ominous atmosphere permeating the house. Each encounter with his mother only deepened the mystery and added to the unsettling feeling that something sinister lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary family dynamics. In the quiet, foreboding morning, Nadia awoke to a chilling realization Asenia was nowhere to be found. A frantic search ensued, intensifying the already strained atmosphere in the household, particularly unsettling the father, whose suspicion and unease grew palpable. Meanwhile, the mother's behavior took a sudden and alarming turn. She materialized in the kitchen, her presence unnervingly naked, both physically and in demeanor. With an eerie strength, she shattered the kitchen table with a single blow of her fist, causing children's teeth and blood to scatter across the floor in a grotesque display. The father, typically aloof and detached, surprisingly exhibited a forceful hold on the main character, preventing any action in the face of escalating horror. Amidst this chaos, the mother invoked a mysterious force, declaring that she had fulfilled the ritual's every requirement: 10 days of seclusion with a chosen heir, devoid of light and sustenance. Her proclamation carried a chilling certainty, hinting at deeper, darker intentions and a disturbing connection to occult practices that had long remained hidden. As tensions peaked and uncertainty loomed, the protagonists grappled with the horrifying reality unfolding before them. The inexplicable events and the mother's disturbing revelation opened a vortex of fear and apprehension, leaving them questioning the true extent of her involvement and the imminent danger facing Yesenia. The once familiar home now seemed a labyrinth of secrets and malevolent forces, plunging them into a nightmarish struggle against the unknown. In the eerie silence of the dimly lit room, an indistinct entity, akin to spatial distortions, began to manifest at the corner of the main character's vision. Its presence loomed ominously behind the mother, casting a chilling pall over the already tense atmosphere. The mother, her demeanor now unsettlingly calm yet insistent, implored her son to consent to becoming a vessel for the dark sorcerer's power. She argued that he was the ideal candidate, incapable of bearing offspring, thus ensuring the purity of the conduit. Meanwhile, Yesenia, caught in the throes of a horrifying incantation, began to suffer visibly. From her convulsing form emerged dark spiders, a grotesque manifestation of the spell's malevolence. As the situation spiraled into a nightmare, Nadia, unable to withstand the onslaught of the dark magic, convulsed violently. Black spiders crawled from her mouth, her body contorting on the floor in agony, suffocating under the weight of the sinister forces at play. The harrowing scene pushed the main character to a precipice, torn between horror and resolve. The unfolding horrors painted a grim tableau of desperation and malevolence, where the boundaries between reality and the arcane blurred ominously. With each passing moment, the protagonists confronted not only the sinister depths of maternal betrayal, but also the existential threat posed by forces beyond comprehension. Their struggle against the encroaching darkness intensified, propelling them toward an inevitable confrontation with the chilling truths lurking within their own home. With the realization that Nadia's life hung precariously in the balance due to him, the main character's resolve shattered through the suffocating grip of fear and uncertainty. In a desperate moment, he shouted his consent to his mother's terms. Instantly, a profound calm washed over his mind and body, replacing all previous anxieties with an eerie sense of tranquility and newfound strength. As if in response to his acquiescence, the sturdy kitchen table suddenly shattered into splinters, an ominous symbol of the forces at play. His mother's laughter echoed unnaturally through the room, resonating with an unsettling blend of triumph and sinister intent. Guided by her, the main character was led outside, leaving Nadia behind, where she slowly began to regain consciousness amidst the wreckage of their shattered reality. Stepping out into the night air, the main character and his mother were greeted by a gathering of people, their faces obscured in the dim light. Their presence marked the beginning of a new chapter, a transformation from the familiar world into an uncertain and hauntingly altered reality. As they moved among the silent assembly, a palpable sense of foreboding lingered, hinting at the profound and irreversible consequences of the pact sealed in the darkness of their home. This unsettling conclusion underscored the narrative's descent into darkness, where choices made under duress blurred the boundaries between salvation and damnation, leaving the main character and those around him to grapple with the haunting aftermath of their decisions.